So even though a high carbohydrate diet might not have been the cause of your condition to begin with, they certainly could be a contributing factor now that the machinery and physiology in your body has broken down. Hey guys, Dr. Bodle here. Now, it's pretty common for people who are looking to improve their nutrition, not just in the thyroid community, but for people kind of in general, is to go low carb or reduce the amount of carbohydrates in their diet. And I think for a lot of reasons, this can be a very positive thing to do. But just like with any type of strategy, there's going to be pros and cons, there's going to be advantages and drawbacks. And today we're going to look a little bit more at the low carb approach. And we're also going to talk about 3 of my patients and some of the changes that they make, which actually led to them getting worse. That way you can learn about what happened, understand a little bit better, and hopefully avoid it in your own life. Now, a question that I get from a lot of people is, when they ask me about how I approach people with thyroid problems, they'll ask me, what kind of diet do you recommend? And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that on social media, you'll have a number of, either influencers or doctors who are kind of tied to a particular approach. And so everything they talk about is going to be, vegan diet or vegetarian or carnivore or keto or paleo or what have you. And the answer that I give to people is that I don't apply a single nutritional approach for my patients. I've made videos before about how our nutrition is a spectrum, and we have to kind of flow back and forth when it comes to the types of foods we're eating, the types of macronutrients and micronutrients that we're including, and that all depends on the person and their own individual needs. However, I have admitted before that if someone were to try to stick me to one particular philosophy, low carb in general does fit with a lot of the things that I'm providing to my patients, and it makes sense for a lot of the goals that we're trying to accomplish. And the reason for this is because all of my recommendations are low carb when compared to the standard diet. So as we know, the standard diet is going to have a lot of processed foods, and on the by and large, that is going to include processed carbohydrates and also processed fats and oils. And I think if we're going to kind of take those initial steps and make some positive changes in our nutrition, one of the best things that we can do is reduce the amount of processed foods that we're including. And if carbs and fats are going to be the ones that are most highly processed, then it makes sense for us to pull those out. And so, it's not 100%, it's a little bit of not a gag, but I'm not being totally true to the reason why I am low carb, but by default, I think we should be lower carbohydrate than the standard American or standard processed diet. Now, of course, I think that we can come to this conclusion that lower carb can be helpful for us just by looking around and using some common sense, but there's also some data to back this up. Now, I would like to point out that nutritional survey data is not great. People do not have good recall. Just ask yourself what you had for dinner, lunch, and breakfast yesterday, and you might struggle a little bit to figure out what that was. And if we're asking you what you had for breakfast a month ago, that could make things worse, so that makes sense. And the other thing is we have a little bit of a healthy bias towards ourselves. So if we are thinking back on what we ate, usually we tend to think a little bit better of ourselves. Oh yeah, I had more broccoli than I did cake that day, even though if that wasn't necessarily the truth. So again, nutritional surveys, they're not perfect, but I think they provide us a little bit of insight, and then we can use that in context with other information to make some good decisions for ourselves. So when we look at the data and we compare the numbers from 1970 to about 2010, there are a couple areas that really stand out in terms of increased amount of intake and increased amount of calories. And these are an increase in the amount of grains that we're consuming, and also an increase in the amount of fats and oils. And each of these categories comes out to about an average of 200 calories each per day for an entire year. So that leads to just under 500 calories per day extra that we're consuming primarily from just these two categories. And the reason why I wanted to point this out is because a lot of times when you suggest that you should reduce a certain part of your diet, especially when it comes to carbohydrates, you'll get pushback and people say, all foods can be good in moderation, you shouldn't be restricting people. And I certainly understand where they're coming from. I think they have some valid points, but I also think our perception is a little bit skewed. If you were to ask someone in the 1970s how many carbohydrates would be a lot, their perspective is going to be different than someone in 2010. And when you have a shift in that expectation or a shift in the norm of what people expect for eating, I think something that might sound dramatic now wouldn't have sounded so dramatic, a couple decades ago. So again, carbohydrates aren't necessarily bad, but our perception of what is normal definitely has changed. And then the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that our health as a society and population has also shifted over the past few decades. We have many more thyroid problems, more chronic inflammatory issues, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, the list goes on. And I think when people are experiencing more of these issues, more of these challenges, and also they're experiencing them for longer periods of time. So for example, something like Hashimoto's, that usually, and you can still look this up, online or in the textbooks, it was very common for women to develop it after they were 40 years old. And now we're seeing young kids with this same sort of condition. So they have to manage it for a much longer period of time. But anyways, all of these conditions have a likelihood of increasing inflammation in the body, which then makes our system less tolerant to carbohydrates and we don't process them as well. So even though a high carbohydrate diet might not have been the cause of your condition to begin with, they certainly could be a contributing factor now that the machinery and physiology in your body has broken down. As we said, thyroid problems change our tolerance for carbohydrates, and that's because of the inflammation that affects our hormones, like insulin, that processes this stuff. But let me give you an example. Let's say someone works a very high stress job, and they are on call all the time where they're receiving text or email, maybe a couple hours after work, or even in the middle of the night. And because their job is so high stress, anytime they see a notification on their phone, they get a little bit, anxious, a little antsy, and they have an increase in cortisol and stress hormones. Now, cortisol, chronic elevations in these types of stress hormones, actually elevates our blood sugar. And the reason for that is because when we have a fight or flight response, when we have this type of stress response, the main goal of it is to help us run away from a threat, fight or flight. And I guess we could be running away or fighting. But I always think of it as a bear coming at us in the woods. And so in that sort of scenario, we would want to run away. Well, if we want to be able to run away properly, we need to increase the amount of fuel in our bloodstream. That way we have plenty for our muscles, so we have the stamina to actually move them and get away. And part of that is increasing our blood sugar. So it's possible that, regardless of what this person is eating, and they could have a very healthy diet, because of the stress that they're experiencing from work and because of the consistency of the stress, they could develop insulin resistance in combination with the other conditions that they're having. And that insulin resistance might be helped out by modulating the amount of carbs that they're eating. Hopefully that makes sense and you can spot the difference between the two. And just, not that you guys wouldn't believe me, but just to add a little bit of legitimacy to that claim, I've had people wear continuous glucose monitors before, and we can easily track different spikes in their blood sugar, and we'll ask them, were you eating at that time? It's like, no, that's when I got a call from work, that's when I got a call from the babysitter, I felt like something was wrong. So those physiological changes can be completely independent of the food that we're eating. But if these chronic thyroid and inflammatory issues make it more difficult for us to process carbohydrates, and we're eating more than usual, and we're living in an environment that makes all of these things worse, it does make sense for us to adopt a little bit of a lower carb approach, but it's still something that we have to go about in the right way. So what we're going to look at now are three of my patients, Susan, Rebecca, and Julie, who all have been struggling with hypothyroidism for an extended period of time, and they all have similar issues with carbohydrate intolerance. So because of this and the research that they did, they all decided to utilize more of a low carb approach, but in different ways, they made choices that weren't really beneficial to their body and actually made some of their problems worse. And so what I want to do is go through each one of their stories, talk about their decisions, why things weren't helpful to them. That way you guys can have a better understanding of things and hopefully not repeat the same errors. So my first patient is Susan. Now Susan is 46 years old, and a few years back she started noticing an increase in hot flashes and some changes in mood that were kind of atypical for her. And when she talked to her mom about it, it was about the same time that her mom went through menopause. So she went into her doctor, and her doctor said, yeah, it's likely that. But she also ran some additional tests and found out that her TSH was high, so she was diagnosed with hypothyroidism. They gave her Synthroid, and she's been taking it since that time. Now, Susan has been an athlete her whole life, and she was able to kind of deal with and manage the hot flashes and the mood changes, but something that was really bothering her was this sort of continual increase in fatigue. Her energy levels, seems like year after year and month after month, were getting worse, and because she liked to do things like swimming and biking and hiking, it was really impairing her ability to do that. So after doing some reading, Susan came across a lot of the stuff that we talked about earlier in the video. And she thought, maybe I am having too many carbohydrates, and especially because of the thyroid and menopausal changes, maybe this is something that can be helpful for me. So she decided to reduce her carbohydrates, and she did that to the point where basically only the only carbohydrates that she was eating were coming from vegetables. She was having a little bit of fruit, but mostly things like berries that are pretty low in sugar anyways, and she was also having a little bit of raw nuts and seeds. Now, here's where the problem started. Of course, whenever you make a dietary change, there's going to be a little bit of lag time where your body has to respond. It's getting fuel from one type of calorie, and when you shift that, it's now going to have to change the enzymes and processing capacity to start extracting energy from other types of fuel. However, when Susan did this, she didn't change her activity level at all. And in fact, she probably increased the amount that she was exercising because she felt like in the past that had been something that helped her to feel energized, helped her to feel better, and she hoped that it would provide her that same boost at this time. Unfortunately, that boost never came, and her ability to work out and her energy levels in general kept getting worse and worse and worse. And for someone who is trying to improve their energy and reduce their fatigue, this obviously wasn't something that she wanted. So what was the problem for Susan? Well, it was actually two main things. The first thing was that, although she might benefit from a lower carbohydrate approach, when she dropped her carbs, she didn't replace those calories with something else. There has to be a balance, and if we want to fuel our body, especially for more intense workouts, when we drop the carbs, we need to increase our fats and proteins. Otherwise, our body is going to totally shut down on us, and again, if we're not eating enough, we're not going to feel very good. The other issue is that she didn't change the intensity or the duration of her exercise, and as I said, she might have actually increased it. Now, when it comes to day-to-day stuff, we have to fuel ourselves, but when it comes to exercise, there's an increased demand. And in actuality, carbohydrates can be really good for providing us a little bit of extra fuel for our exercise. And I will often say that we should titrate the amount of carbs that we're eating with the amount of exercise that we're doing. So if she was going to increase her exercise, then maybe she would want to increase her carbohydrates in accordance with that. That doesn't mean having huge amounts of carbohydrates, but she might have not had to be so strict where she was only having, vegetables, a little bit of low sugar fruit, and then also those nuts and seeds. So what did we do to fix it? Well, the first thing that we did was we had her eat more. We increased her protein intake, and we also had her add a little bit of starchy carbohydrates. She seemed to tolerate things like rice pretty well, so we had her have some more servings of rice and also included things like sweet potato and squash to provide her with a little bit more starch. In addition to that, on days where she was doing more of a hard workout, we would have her increase her fruit intake and sometimes take a tablespoon or two of honey before her workouts to try to buffer the amount of demand that her body required and therefore allow her to make it through easier and have the fuel that she would need for the rest of the day. Additionally, we provided her some products to help ease the transition into menopause, and these included some herbal supports like Dong Quai, black cohosh, and vitex berry, in addition to some things to help support her adrenal system like ashwagandha, ginseng, and holy basil. Finally, we found out that sometimes when her exercise was getting too much for her, it wouldn't allow her to sleep as restfully and she wouldn't feel kind of restored and rejuvenated the next day like we'd like. So we were making sure that she was getting proper amounts of sleep, which is another thing that can affect our tolerance for carbohydrates. And we also had her take breaks or do a bit of a deload week every month. That way she wasn't overdoing it with her exercise in general. And just a quick note here, that whether it's with Susan or my other two patients that I'm about to talk about, or you or anyone in general, whenever we're making decisions, I know health can sometimes seem really complex, but as long as we're being targeted and choosing things that make sense, we don't have to get too exotic in general. Some people do need that extra step. We do need to be a bit more nuanced, but in Susan's case, it was having her eat more, adding a little bit of extra carbohydrate. She was still low carb, but she had more carbs than she started out with. And we used some herbs to help support the systems that weren't working as well. And we made sure she was doing some basic things like not overtraining and sleeping. So it really can be that easy. Again, we just want to support the body in the areas that it needs. But once we made these changes, Susan noticed just after a few weeks that her energy levels were much better, and they continued to improve for her week after week and month after month, to the point where after about 3 months, she was feeling back to her old self again. She was able to do more of that physical activity like she liked, and when she was doing her regular, work day or at-home chores or anything like that, she wasn't feeling impaired in any way with her fatigue. So it did take a little bit of time, but we saw those results and those changes early on that let us know we were on the right path. Now, my next patient's name is Rebecca. She's a really cool gal. She's 33 years old, and she's very much kind of type A, very much a go-getter, and she works in marketing for a tech company. And as you might imagine, there's a lot of stress that goes along with her job. Now, Rebecca's always been a smaller, slimmer gal, and she knows that historically, when she doesn't eat, it can make a lot of things worse for her. And in particular, she notices the onset of headaches and also an increase in her anxiety. When she was back in college, she was going through a period where she had a lot of tough classes and she was coming up to the end of the quarter, and her anxiety really got out of control because of, at the time, she assumed the increased stress, the lack of sleep, and all the things that come along with that. So after her finals, she was able to kind of push through. She went and saw her doctor and was given an anti-anxiety medication, and they also noted that she had some thyroid changes, so she was provided levothyroxine at that time. Now initially, these medications seemed to be a big help for her, but as the years have gone on, she noted that sometimes she'll go on vacation or forget to take her medications, and she really doesn't notice a change one way or the other. But even though life has taken her in a bunch of different directions since she was in college to now where she's 33 working for this tech company, she has still been in that kind of fight or flight, on the go type of survival mentality, and it really isn't doing a lot of favors for her health. Rebecca finds that she has to have something sugary or carby or she feels like she'll crash, and she relies on caffeine to get her through the day. And just like she's known her whole life where if she doesn't eat, her symptoms tend to get worse, well, if she gets too engrossed in her work and forgets to eat and goes maybe 4 or 5 hours, those headaches can become very severe and her anxiety gets much worse. In an effort to combat these symptoms and hopefully make some improvements, Rebecca decided to go low carb. But what she experienced was sort of the same thing that she experiences when she goes too long without eating. Her anxiety got worse in general, and she also started to have issues with her ability to stay asleep. This had a bit of a compounding aspect to it where now every morning she was waking up at 3 a.m. instead of 6 a.m. and it started to make her fatigue worse, her brain fog worse, her anxiety then continued to worsen for her, and she felt like her performance at work just wasn't where it should be. And that then contributed extra stress to everything that she was dealing with. So in Susan's case, some of the issue with the low carb approach was demand. Her demand from calories was higher than she was providing her body with. And the issue for Rebecca, in a similar way, is also demand. But in this scenario, it's due to the amount of work that she's doing and it's due to the amount of stress that she's under. When you're stressed and you have an increase in stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, you're going to get a low-grade increase in a lot of the physiological changes that we associate with stress. So just think about yourself if you had to make a public speech and that's something that you're not very comfortable with. You know, your heart might start racing a little bit, you're going to start breathing a little bit quicker, you're going to sweat a little bit, maybe too much, right? And all of these things require energy, and they are all driven by that increase in stress hormones. So even though it might not be a huge difference, if someone is stressed all the time, like Rebecca is, we're going to start burning off that freely available glucose, and the demand for carbohydrates is then going to go up. And little side note here, this is also why a lot of people crave sweets or carbohydrates when they're stressed. It's for the exact same mechanism and for the exact same reason. But when Rebecca took away that sort of fast fuel, those carbohydrates that would then replace the ones that she was burning off, it started to decrease the function of her body because she wasn't making enough energy, and in particular, her brain wasn't responding well to it. Without enough energy, her brain couldn't function properly, and that then made the anxiety worse. So how did we work with Rebecca? Well, we did the best we could, but this isn't necessarily a success story. Similar to Susan, I had her increase the overall amount that she was consuming, and we also made sure to focus in on healthy fats and proteins because those tend to provide us energy for a longer period of time. But we also had her increase the amount of carbohydrates that she was eating because we felt that with her stress, we needed to provide a little bit of that quicker fuel source to balance out the proteins and fats. At the same time, we got her off of all caffeine because even though she was using it to get through her day and survive, it wasn't allowing her to progress and it was only making things worse. Finally, I used every stress strategy with her that I could think of. I had her walking and doing light exercise. She had an at-home meditation program. She was recommended for therapy. She was doing breathing exercises. Everything that we could do, she had it. But when it came down to it, her work was so stressful that it was making all of that other stuff, even though it was helpful, it wasn't allowing us to make the changes that we wanted. And when she was able to go on vacation, that was really the only time where she said to me, Dr. Brad, I actually feel more like myself. I feel more grounded, and I can kind of breathe a little bit. So in her case, it became a situation of just trying to manage it and keep her anxiety levels as low as possible. And we did our best through, again, those nutrition and lifestyle changes. But because of her work, that anxiety never completely went away, and she continues to struggle with those stress levels and the headaches that can come on when work stress does ratchet up. But real quick, before we move on to my last patient, I just wanted to give you a quick reminder that if you've been enjoying the information, please remember to like and subscribe. I really do appreciate the support, and it does help out the channel. And finally, my last patient is Sally. Sally is 38 years old, and she has 2 kids. Her second kid was born when she was 33, and at that time she noticed an increase in fatigue, hair loss, and although she had some testing done, the doctor didn't really explain to her that her thyroid antibodies were positive and that it was indicative of Hashimoto's. As the years went on, the fatigue and the hair loss resolved a bit, but she noticed that the weight she gained during pregnancy didn't resolve like the one after her first pregnancy. And in fact, every year subsequently, she tended to gain a few more pounds, and it was just something that didn't feel healthy for her, and she really wanted to improve it so she could be active with her kids and feel comfortable in her own clothes. When it comes to making dietary changes, Sally felt like she had tried every diet out there, but she had never tried going low carb because she really couldn't see herself without some of her favorite foods. However, she reached a breaking point when she realized she was 60 pounds over where she was comfortable with and decided that this was the point where she would do anything that would help. Since she hadn't tried low carb before, that was the direction that she went in. So I just realized that I told you my 3 patients were Susan, Rebecca, and Julie. And again, just like always, these are not real names for people. So if they are your names, these are probably not you. Maybe they could be you, but they're probably not you. And then I changed Julie to Sally, and I had originally changed Sally to Julie because I just didn't want 2 S names, but we're gonna stick with Sally for now since that's what I've been yammering on about for the past few minutes. So because Sally was so committed to losing weight, she made stricter changes than my other 2 patients. She was only getting her carbohydrates from fibrous vegetables and was avoiding fruits, nuts and seeds, starchy vegetables like potatoes, and doing her best to really focus on getting most of her calories from proteins and fats. Now, unlike Susan, she knew that she would have to increase these other calories. And she had heard that if you start to eat more fat, your body will become more efficient at burning that fat. And since she wanted to lose body fat, she felt like this made a lot of sense to her. Now, I am a big believer in the fact that a lot of people don't eat enough fat. And if they are eating fat, they usually aren't eating very healthy fats. Go back to what we talked about in the beginning where those processed fats and oils tend to be one of the things that stands out that people are consuming a lot more of these days. Plus, if we get our fat intake too low, it can have a negative impact on our ability to build cholesterol and hormones. It can affect our fat-soluble vitamins, and our brain really requires fat, not just for fuel, but for the myelin sheath, the wrapping around our neurons. That way we can have fast transmission and communication within our brain between different areas. So yes, fat, definitely important, definitely something that we need to include in our diet, but just like with anything, we don't want to become totally imbalanced with it where we're consuming way too much. And in Sally's case, this is where we made a little bit of our error. Like I said before, Sally thought that if she wanted to lose body fat, then she needed to eat more fat and become a fat-burning machine. But she was adding so much fat to her diet, putting butter in her coffee, covering her food in olive oil, adding a lot of extra nut butters to her smoothies. And while some of this can be great, fat is still a fuel, and our body still needs to either process it or it needs to store it. And although Sally had increased some of her exercise, the amount of fats that she was consuming just wasn't something that her body could keep up with. So when Sally initially switched to her low carb approach, she very quickly lost about 4.5 or 5 pounds. And this was something that was super exciting to her because up until that point, again, nothing had made a difference. However, as she progressed forward, that weight came back. And in fact, after a few months, she noticed that she was actually up 7 to 8 pounds. Otherwise, she was feeling okay, but because her main goal was to improve her body composition and get back some of her old self, she felt like she was failing. So how'd we help Sally? Or Julie, depending on what you prefer? Well, we simply reframed the way she was approaching things. We continued to allow her to follow that low carb approach because when she did eat carbohydrates, she had a lot of fatigue after meals, and we felt that that was something that was not beneficial to her. But when it came to her fat intake, all we did was we changed the amount that she was eating. I told her exactly what I told you guys, which is that fat is healthy for us. But when we overprocess it and start adding it to everything, it's hard for our body to have a good gauge of satiety with that stuff, and it's hard for us to know when we've had too much. So instead of trying to add fat at every different opportunity, I encouraged her to include fat in its whole food form. getting it from things like fatty meats, eggs, avocados, nuts and seeds, and limiting the amounts of processed fats, oils, and butters that she was adding to her meals. As you guys know, I don't think calories explain everything when it comes to weight loss, but I do think they have a role. And by bringing the amount of calories down that Sally was consuming, while also addressing some things around her exercise and her sleep, she started to see some more consistent changes. Now, as we've talked about in other videos, something that I think is really important for us to keep in mind is that a lot of this weight loss isn't going to occur all at once. And Sally had been battling this for a number of years, not just because of what she was eating, but also because of some of her thyroid issues. So in the beginning, her progress was slow, only about 3 pounds per month. But as we tracked not only her weight on the scale and also the inches around her waist, we were able to catch any times where we were a little bit off. We made sure that things stayed consistent and were progressing forward. And again, although 3 pounds in a month doesn't sound like much, when we were able to string that together over a year's time, she had lost 36 pounds. And while she wasn't to her goal yet, she was feeling way better and she was having a much easier time staying consistent. And when things did go wrong, she didn't notice her weight jumping up so dramatically like it had in the past. So after hearing those 3 stories, I hope you're able to get some valuable information and maybe take a few things home that you can apply to your own life. But what I would like to just highlight for you is that, again, carbs aren't necessarily bad, but they are something that we can adjust and use in a beneficial way for us. However, just like with anything in health, it's not always about what we're eating. I like to say that nutrition doesn't fix everything, but it can help with just about anything. And in these scenarios, we learned that, yeah, nutrition can be helpful, but if we're not taking into account the bigger picture and looking at the lifestyle as well, then if we're not doing the proper things with our nutrition, it can actually make these things a bit more of a struggle for us. And finally, if we're not achieving the changes that we want, then the adjustments that we need to make, as long as they're sensible, shouldn't be too dramatic. Rather, they should be more targeted. So as long as we're making those small changes that we can track, it'll give us better feedback and hopefully better results. That way we can continue to build on them and allow us to continue to see those positive improvements. If you like this video but have a question, leave me a comment. If you enjoyed the information but still feel like you need some additional help, support, and guidance and would like to work with me one-on-one, then you can start that process by sending an email to contact@seattlethyroidhelp.com. And once my staff receives your information, they'll reach out to you and see if they can set up a time for a free one-on-one consultation with me where we can discuss your health goals and make sure that we're a good fit to work together. I don't work with everyone because I'm not a good fit for everyone. And we just want to make sure that you're in the right spot for you and you're getting the results that you deserve. If you'd rather work on some things at home, check out my links in the description box where you can find my free downloads for either the food list that I use with a lot of my Hashimoto's patients or the electrolyte recommendations that I use for a lot of people who are following a low carbohydrate way of eating, which of course might be a little bit more valuable if you are interested in today's topic. Otherwise, I appreciate you guys so much. You really are the best and it means a ton to me that you're here. If you want to support the channel in other ways, please remember to like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and if you want to follow me on social media, you can find my links for Instagram and Facebook down below. But my name is Dr. Bodle. I hope you guys have an excellent week and I'll see you in the next one.